Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. There's no such thing as unilateral security. All real security is always collective. This is precisely how Russia views endless Western hostility and NATO expansion to the east. Moscow has presented ways to avoid conflict and assure all security. Is the West asleep at the switch? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is a historian, analyst, and author of the book, Arise Rossiya, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And in Budapest, we have George Samueli. He is a podcaster at The Gaggle, which can be found on YouTube and Locals. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. All right, let's start out in Budapest here. George, it's been about a week now since the Russians have sent two proposals to the United States and to NATO. We've gotten mixed reactions from the foreign policy blob. Apparently, in July, there'll be some kind of talks in Geneva. Again, really thin information on that. And it seems to me that the Russians have made a very clear case that they feel that their security is being threatened, and they have a solution to improve and protect the security of all. And we can go into that. But the reaction to it is mediocre at best. And the last thing, and I want to make this clear to all our viewers, the last thing the Russians want to hear is, yeah, we'll sit down and talk. The time for talk has come to an end. There are documents on the table. Let's go through them and let's sign them publicly. George.
You summarized it excellently, Peter. I think that's exactly what the Russians are saying, which is that we have been saying the same thing to you over and over again, starting from 1991, when Mikhail Gorbachev was asking for assurances from the West that the West would not expand into the space left after the withdrawal of the Warsaw Pact. And we've complained again and again, and the West has treated our complaints with contempt. They just said, hey, you lost the Cold War, them's the breaks. And now that the geopolitical situation has changed very much in an adverse fashion for the West is still playing this game of coming up with these silly legalistic arguments like, well, every country has the sovereign right to decide its own security arrangement. And in any case, we never promised you anything. And even if we did promise you anything, we didn't put it in writing. And in any case, NATO is a defensive alliance, however much it may expand all the way into Central Asia up to Chinese borders, it's still a defensive alliance. And so they're coming up with this kind of nonsense, and Russia's just saying we're in no mood for that. And so I think, as you said, the meetings in January almost certainly will entail the West coming up with the usual complaints. Oh, you're interfering in our elections, and you're spreading disinformation via RT, and we don't like the way you move your armies around within your borders. And if the West comes up with these sorts of disingenuous arguments, I think the Russians just say, enough already, we're out of here.
And Marcus, all the while, offensive military material is being sent to Ukraine. There's different sourcing about the number of quote unquote specialists and advisors. And again, in the possibility of some type of missile systems. I mean, the time for talking is over, because I think that really frustrates me most, and George and I have talked about this almost on a daily basis, is that the Kremlin has been telegraphing this intensely through all of its highest officials and its media. And it doesn't seem to get trickled through to Western policymakers, as if they just don't take any of this seriously. Your thoughts, Marcus?
Let us be emphatically clear about something, Peter. The crisis over Ukraine is, in the short term, on account of the West's engineered coup in Kiev in February of 2014, which brought a pro-Western, anti-Russian government to power. And in the long term, it is a result of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe and into the Baltic states, something that the Americans verbally assured Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990 would not happen. Indeed, the then American Secretary of State, James Baker, said to Gorbachev, quote, "not 1 inch eastwards." But alas, the naive, incompetent fool that Gorbachev was never demanded of the Americans that they put that into writing. Now, turning to the Kremlin's demands, they are the demands that any self-respecting country would make, namely that NATO puts into writing, it pledges in writing that it will not admit Ukraine, Moldova or Georgia into its ranks, and secondly, that NATO will withdraw its forces from the Russian border. Now, NATO is actually obliged by the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 to not have its forces in Eastern Europe and also in the Baltic states. Which brings me on to another point, Peter. Even if NATO was to put into writing what the Kremlin is demanding of it, a pledge by NATO orally or in writing is actually worthless because firstly, NATO has, as I already said, has violated the NATO-Russia Founding Act by positioning its forces in the Baltic states in Eastern Europe. And secondly, NATO violated its own founding treaty in 1991 when it bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Specifically, it violated Article 1 of the bloc's founding treaty, which stipulates that the bloc will never use force to resolve a dispute. So quite frankly, Peter, a pledge from NATO, even in writing, is absolutely worthless.
You know, George, I find another thing I find really frustrating. You know, we've been talking for 6 minutes and 3 seconds already in this program, and all of us have mentioned dates, agreements, conversations that are documented. I mean, and then I look at Western coverage and all of this, and none of it is ever brought up. I mean, we're sourcing this all of the time on a microscopic level. And again, you know, then Stoltenberg says, well, we never said NATO wouldn't expand. Well, what is that supposed to mean? And why should I care? I mean, is NATO etched into international law as if it's the prism in which the globe sees its security? I mean, this is absurd, but they want us to believe this. George, help me, I'm frustrated.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That has been the NATO creed. And of course, why NATO has been getting away with it for 30 years is that they were convinced in 1990 that Russia is now a hopeless, weak basket case. It's now a half of the size of the Soviet Union. It doesn't have any kind of economic clout, and it could just treat Russia with contempt. I mean, you know, over and over again, Russia has made the same complaints. I mean, there was obviously the famous Munich Security Conference speech by Vladimir Putin in 2007, and there have been repeated complaints. And you know, NATO's attitude is, yeah, this is so boring. We're not interested. You don't have a leg to stand on because we are much stronger than you are. And what has happened is we're finding that you know, NATO really isn't terribly strong. Russia has made enormous leaps in terms of its strategic weaponry with these hypersonic weapons. More seriously, and this came out in the video conference between Putin and Xi Jinping. I mean, China has said, we support Russia's core security interests. China doesn't just say these things, you know, because it likes empty, pompous phrases. It meant that on this issue, we are right behind you. And that if this comes to a confrontation, we will also act in a way that is supportive of Russia. So now suddenly, I mean, at least some of the brighter bulbs in the West are realizing we could have a two-front war on our hands, and there's no way we can take on two superpowers at the same time. We can't take one superpower on. I mean, we're used to fighting against Haiti or Panama or Yugoslavia or Iraq or Libya. we're not used to fighting superpowers and a two-front war. So suddenly, I think the smarter Western leaders are realizing that this is really working against us, and we're going to have to do something. But unfortunately, the dimwits, the Stoltenbergs, are still mouthing these stupid cliches, and they don't quite realize that the days of those cliches are now long gone.
And Marcus, the publics around the world are poorly served by constantly by the media characterizing this as a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which it is not. And the documents that have been sent to the United States and to NATO by Russia have to do with security across the entire Eurasian landmass. But the media constantly is focusing on one issue. No, these documents were composed mostly out of frustration after 30 years to saying we need to think about everyone's security, but it's never phrased that way. It's never given to the public that way. And this is a huge disinformation campaign that can, and what we'll say in the second part of the program, what possibly could happen. Go ahead, Marcus.
Furthermore, Peter, Western mainstream media is making the argument, which is an utterly untenable argument, that the Ukrainian and Russian peoples are distinct from one another, which of course is a way of making the case even further for Ukraine to join NATO. But when you actually inform Western journalists that the Russian and Ukrainian peoples are the same people, they are East Slavs, then there is silence from the mouths of these wretched men and women, because they know next to nothing. Indeed, let me reword that. They know nothing about the history of Russia. They know nothing about the history of Ukraine. And when I have told them before in television debates that in March of 1991, over 70% of the population of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic voted to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The truth of the matter is that the only part of Ukraine where you will find anti-Russian sentiment is the westernmost, in places such as Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil. Why? Because that part of Ukraine was a part of Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire for centuries. But if you visit Odessa, if you visit Kharkov, if you visit Kherson, if you visit Nikolaev, if you visit Dnipro-Dzhinsk or Dnipropetrovsk, you will find the majority of people there identify themselves as part of the Russian world. That is another reason why this matter for Russia is so very, very personal.
On that point, to jump in here, we're going to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on security for all. Stay with Arthur. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. This is the home edition. To remind you, we're talking about security for all. Okay, let's go back to George in Budapest. Okay, in the first part of the program, we talked about really the kind of political, diplomatic activities that are going on, irrespective of how serious Western policymakers are taking it. Again, I want to reaffirm to everyone watching here is that we've gotten a lot of mixed messages. We have Borrell in the EU saying that the EU has a stake at the table, which is kind of interesting because they're the ones greatly affected by this. But I mean, the policymakers in the Biden administration kind of a blasé response. But, you know, looking at what Russian officials are talking about, if this political diplomatic path fails, they've already considered appropriate military, technical, reciprocal measures. I'm quoting a number of Russian foreign policy officials. This is serious business, George.
Yeah, it really is. And the Russians have repeatedly referred to the exemplar of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy administration laid it on the line to Khrushchev, which is that you're stationing missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, is an existential threat to the United States. And we are not interested in your disingenuous legalistic arguments that, well, these missiles are entirely defensive, and Cuba is a sovereign country and has a sovereign right to decide who provides it with missiles and so on. Basically saying, either you get these missiles out or we will. And we're going to do it very quickly. And the Russians are precisely referring to that. That's our attitude now. We're just not interested in your disingenuous arguments about the sovereign rights of the Ukrainian people, which is at the moment we think that what you're doing in Ukraine is affecting us in a profound existential way, we will act unilaterally. And that means, you know, if you're going to continue to dump military hardware, build up a NATO military infrastructure, if you're going to station electronic surveillance bases here in Ukraine, we will act unilaterally and we will just take them out. And that's what the West doesn't seem to realize, that you know, Russia really means it, and then they're going to act unilaterally. And really, there's very little that NATO is going to be able to do about it.
You know, Marcus, this is again what's so frustrating. It's as if this is a big bluff or a game of chicken here, and it's not. I mean, we have as recently as August 2008. When Saakashvili foolishly attacked South Ossetia, thinking it was going to be over in a weekend, the Russians reacted, and the Russians had made it very clear that they would react. They did. They went into the interior of the country, and just as George was hinting to, destroyed all of the NSA infrastructure, all of the electronic eavesdropping that was laser focused on Russia. They destroyed it all, up to what I've been told, up to $1 billion worth. I think we see the future if NATO continues on the path of what it's doing in Ukraine. As George said, if you don't take it out, we will. Go ahead.
Let us not forget that up until the Cuban Missile Crisis, America had missiles in Turkey which were aimed at the Soviet Union and which were ready to be equipped with nuclear warheads. But returning to Ukraine, the problem here is quite simple. Now that Ukraine is in the West's sphere of influence, the Americans will not let the country go easily. Therefore, it is down to Russia to take very, very clinical action, because Russia will go to war to defend its national security. And Ukraine is Russia's soft underbelly. Under no circumstances can the Russian government allow Ukraine to be in NATO, or for NATO forces to be even more widely deployed in the country, because that would pose a most perilous threat to the security of Russia and to the security of the Russian people. And also, the Americans could extend their missile defense system in Eastern Europe into Ukraine. And that would mean that the Russian strategic nuclear arsenal would be in dire trouble. So unless the Americans relent and put into writing, though, as I said earlier on, I don't think a pledge from them in writing would mean anything. But if they do put into writing that Ukraine would not be admitted into the ranks of the Western military bloc, and if they do pull their forces back from Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, then of course tension will somewhat decrease. But the problem is that in a year from now, in 2 years from now, we could be at this position again. That is why decisive action has to be taken by Russia, because the day will come when Ukraine does enter the ranks of NATO, and by then it will just be too late for Russia. But I don't think that day will ever come. The Ukraine should never have been allowed to enter the West sphere of influence in the first place. But now we are in a very dangerous situation. And as you said, Peter, the chances of an accidental war breaking out between America and Russia are very distinct.
No, well, I think there are circles in Washington that do want to have a conflict, because isn't it really convenient, George, that the U.S. won't commit troops, the U.K. won't commit troops, okay? But if there's military action on the part of the Russians, which it is a reaction to what NATO is doing, they will be sanctions here. I mean, if I were in the Kremlin, I'd say just enough of this. Okay, there is a clear a threat to our national security. It is existential, and we will address it. Okay, whatever the cost may be. What bothers me is that I think that the West is just sleepwalking. It's that they don't take it seriously. Somehow NATO is a virtuous organization, which is really strange to me. It's a military bloc. Okay, what was it on Twitter? Don't doubt your belief in NATO. That's bizarre. It's a military alliance here. There's just plenty of people in the West that do want to see some kind of conflict here, because NATO has painted itself into a corner here. It must succeed in NATO or in Ukraine, or cease to exist. It always creates these zero-sum binary decisions. George.
Yes, I agree. I think there is some calculation that if indeed Russia intervenes militarily and reincorporates within Russia the Donbass, then essentially NATO will be consolidated. NATO will be able to impose its draconian sanctions on Russia, kick Russia out of the SWIFT financial transaction system, and Russia will just be pushed further eastward and out of the West altogether. I think there's a calculation of that. The problem that NATO has is that if indeed such a scenario plays out, NATO will be shown to have been a paper tiger, because NATO will have it's done is that it's issued all sorts of guarantees that was really just paper or toy money.
Right.
I mean, the Baltic states were under the impression that they were being given actual money, the actual guarantees of security. But suddenly people are going to be realizing in the West, does anyone really believe NATO is ready to go to war, up to nuclear war, for Estonia, for Lithuania, for Latvia? I mean, and so on. So therefore, I think the NATO bluff, which is what has been going on, these empty guarantees that it's been issuing, like so much candy, will have been shown to be absolutely ridiculous, because NATO ultimately isn't going to be able to go to war on behalf of these tiny states. And so NATO is going to have to start backtracking and telling Estonia, which is, don't provoke Russia. I mean, this is what you're doing is really stupid. You're mistreating your Russian nationals. You're desecrating the World War II memorials. Russians getting angrier and angrier about this. And we can't come in on your side and say, yeah, we're ready to go to a nuclear war on your behalf. So I think it could well be the beginning of the end for NATO.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus, I absolutely agree with George's analysis. They're in the process of signing their own pink slip here, because they're putting it's in all or nothing. Okay, as I said at the very top of the program, there's no such thing as unilateral security. All real security is collective security. Why can't these eggheads or nutcases in NATO understand that? Because if you're an egghead, usually people think you're smart. These people are not smart. Go ahead.
It was one thing, Peter, for NATO to have expanded into Poland. It was another to have expanded into the Baltic states. Anyone with an ounce of common sense, with an ounce of enlightenment at the time the Baltic states were admitted into the ranks of the Western military bloc would have known that NATO was overstretching itself, and even more so when it comes to Ukraine. But alas, we have a situation today where NATO, which is a monstrously criminal bloc, which demonstrated its criminality when it bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, is intent on bringing Ukraine into its ranks, because that would mean Russia is encircled on its western border from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They know the dangers of the game they are playing in Washington and in London and, of course, in Brussels. but their incessant need, their incessant lust for further influence, of further power, to see Russia forced out of Europe could result in the most appalling of wars that Europe has known since the end of the Second World War. That will not be Russia's fault. That will be NATO's fault.
I'm going to open up a can of worms, George, 30 seconds. But considering the entire NATO project for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is completely in tatters right now and falling apart, that's the future of Ukraine if they want it. And then you'll have a Europe that is completely isolated from the world, not Russia. Go ahead. 30
Yes, isolated from the world, because the geopolitical forces have very dramatically deteriorated for the West. There is China, and China and Russia are now almost certainly strategic allies. So any conflict that's going to take place in Europe, there could very well be a second front opening up by China. China said it will help Russia in any way it can, and therefore, there'll be a conflict over Taiwan, and then what exactly is the West going to do? And so it'd be a huge, catastrophic humiliation for the West. So it's a very serious situation for the West.
I'm going to end on that note because I think it's correct here. I want to thank my guests in London and Budapest. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, cross talk rules.